could you just briefly explain when you've got a foreign debt in a, or a currency in a foreign debt, and it's, a few £billion, how does that figure change the way that you manage and structure your economy? Because it's pretty significant, isn't it, when you've got that amount of debt that you're forced to pay off?
Yeah, if you look at any country in the global south, you look at the annual or quarterly central bank report from that country. And it's usually a report about the state of the economy and what the central bank is trying to do and so on. Typically, the very first few pages, and this is either the report from the central bank or in the parliament, when the parliament is proposing the new budget for the next year and how they budget this. This is from the Ministry of Finance. The first few pages of those reports are typically about the global economy. And they start by saying, this is how much, we're expected to pay in debt service next year. So that's the priority of the budget. It's already committed to that. And then they say, this is how much we expect energy prices, fuel prices to be, and therefore this is how much we expect to pay for energy imports. That's already committed. There's no negotiation there. This is how much we expect wheat prices, corn prices, core food prices to be, and this is therefore how much we have to commit to that. And then whatever is left, they say, and then there's, whatever is left is military and health and education, and whatever is left at the end is left to budget. So the biggest priorities that should drive economic transformation and actual development are usually put at the end of that document, with whatever is left after we've paid interest, after we've paid the debt, after we've paid for the fact that we're food dependent and energy dependent. Whatever is left, that goes to what should have been the biggest priorities on page one, which is health. Yeah, exactly. So this is typical, and this is what this colonial debt entrapment does, is that it forces you to rewire your entire economic policy to prioritize debt payments and food imports and fuel imports and medical imports, because you don't have those resources, and those are priorities. But then most importantly, it forces you to rewire your priorities to invest in things that allow you to earn more dollars and more euros. And that sometimes means investing more in tourism. Except tourism is also a structural trap, because if you're going to bring, say, 10 million tourists, sounds great. You're going to bring 10 million tourists spending, dollars and euros in your economy, except those 10 million tourists, you have to feed them. So you increase your food imports. And those 10 million tourists, you have to house them, transport them, heat and cool the hotels for them. So your energy imports increase even more. So the net effect of that prioritizing tourism as an engine of development ends up being an additional drain of your financial resources. And you become locked into that approach, because now half of your economy is dependent on tourism. So you can't stop your addiction to tourism, which means you can't stop your addiction to food imports and fuel imports. And you're back in that in that trap. Foreign direct investment. You say, well, let's prioritize in infrastructure to prepare industrial zones for foreign direct investors to come and set up shop here and create jobs. Well, sounds great, except that foreign direct investment that's moving to your global south economy is only interested in assembly line, low-cost labor type of manufacturing. So it's going to force you to import more fuel to power those factories. You're going to import all the components, and you're just racing to the bottom. And typically you have to subsidize them, right? You give them tax exemptions, you subsidize workers' wages, you subsidize the food that workers consume, the energy that workers consume, to minimize the cost on those corporations. And then the profits generated from that manufacturing unit are going to be repatriated to investors in the global north, not reinvested in your country. So there you go. That's your economic development now, is wired to attract as much dollars to the economy without recognizing that it's actually bleeding even more dollars in that process. And there's no transformation. You're still locked in the same, bottom of the global value chain colonial position.
Sitting here trying to make notes and listen to everything you're saying, and a lot of what you've covered if I look at it purely from a Scottish perspective, seems to be how our economy is structured at the moment, and what our structure of our economy might be like kind of post-independence. Is it crass of me to say that I see the Scottish economy as a colonial economy, considering all the things that you've been discussing so far? Or can you start to see those similarities?
Well, it's fascinating once you start looking at, old colonies, from more than a century ago, and how the structural, sometimes even the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of the country is still perpetuating the same colonial relationships. And one of those is usually the actual physical infrastructure for extracting natural resources, transporting and shipping them to the mainland, right, of the colony. So if you tell me that Scotland today, or Scotland during, the colonial times, was a source of extraction of materials to go into England, but after, a couple of hundred years, the Scottish economy was so transformed and became so independent that it has its own infrastructure, for example, ports to ship to the global economy on its own terms, then I'll tell you the Scottish economy is probably partially decolonized. But if you tell me that Scotland still uses the same roads to ship resources to the same destination in England, then that tells me that partly the Scottish economy is still structurally tied in colonial relationships with England. If you tell me that Scotland has its own independent currency, right, with its own independent monetary policy and fiscal policy, then I tell you it's probably decolonized. But if you tell me it still uses the same colonial currency with the same more or less colonial constraints, then yeah, you still have colonial structures. If you tell me that Scotland has now independently developed its own resources for its own benefits, for its own food sovereignty and energy sovereignty on its own terms as basic pillars of development, because no country can function without food, without fuel, then I'll tell you, yes, Scotland is probably decolonized and independent. But if Scotland is still food dependent by design, and if Scotland's most of its energy, and it has huge energy potential, is destined for extraction and export rather than as an input for industrialization and development and value addition in Scotland, then I'll tell you Scotland still probably follows the same colonial patterns that you see in many parts of the global South. So those are kind of the parameters I would look at. When,
well, unfortunately, I am telling you all of those things, which is a real concern coming from someone like you. I said I was noting them down, thinking, but it's probably very different. But that's a huge concern that that we have at the moment, an economy that you could describe as being still colonial. Can you also talk about this ownership? Because in Scotland, we've got, some big energy companies and big resource extraction companies, but very few of those companies, even into financial services, which I would describe as part of this resource extraction, are Scottish companies. Where does this ownership, if you've not got much ownership in your economy, does that point to being a colonial economy as well?
Yes, because that means extraction of wealth, extraction of profits. And that is not just about the ownership, actually, it's about the control of technology, right? So you might look around the Scottish economy, you see quite a bit of sophisticated technology around. Like who's producing this technology, who's owning it, who controls access to this technology? Is there actual transfer of technology to Scottish company, to Scottish know-how, to build the foundation for research and development of made in Scotland technology that will actually have global influence? Then that tells you that you're still operating, at the bottom of the hierarchy of the colonial structure in today's global economy. And you're still the source of extraction of wealth, because you're a consumer of technology, you're a consumer of products that are made and owned by other nations or other corporations. So it's fascinating when you look at some economies in Europe that still operate under these colonial rules, and the rules of international trade and investment architecture are designed to perpetuate this, because these are rules that don't allow for transfer of technology, for example. right? You can only buy it or rent it from the countries that dominate this technology.
As you might be aware, when Scotland becomes independent, part of the plan is for Scotland to take on a big chunk of the current UK debt, and that'll be billions of pounds, which must be payable in English pounds. Could you just kind of paint a picture for us of and how that's likely to affect us as we become an independent country again?
It's actually designed precisely not to make you independent. And this is not new, actually. All the former colonies in Africa were given the same deal. You get independence and you get a share of the debt. And it's actually worse than that. When Europe and the United States canceled the German debt in 1953, the London Accords in 1953, which canceled 50% of Germany's debt. This was part of the process of rebuilding Germany and reindustrializing Germany on new terms under the Marshall Plan. One of the things that England in particular forced onto its former colonies in Africa and the rest of the global South was, as part of your independence deal, you have to take a slice of the German debt cancellation and carry that yourself. So today we have countries in the global South who are deeply indebted, countries that actually contributed to Germany's debt cancellation. And there's movements today in the global South
that is incredible,
asking Germany specifically to reciprocate. Right? Germany is not a poor country today. Actually, Germany in 1953, with that debt cancellation, wouldn't have qualified for any debt relief under today's terms and conditions of debt relief. With the climate crisis, with HIV/AIDS crisis, with the hunger crisis, all of the crises that we've seen in the global South that warrant debt cancellation, Germany in 1953, with those numbers, with those ratios, wouldn't have qualified for any debt relief. And yet 50% of its debt was canceled. And it was coupled by a transfer of financial resources, technological resources to reindustrialize Germany after the war. This is something that most people don't even know.
Yeah.
When I share this with people, say, you're making this up. I say, go look up the London Accords, go look up the Marshall Plan. The US gifted 5% of its GDP after World War II. And this was after a very expensive war, which came after a very expensive Great Depression. The US managed to gift the equivalent of $1.2 trillion in today's money, right? In addition to 50% debt cancellation by most of Europe, but also with participation from developing countries and the global South, including Pakistan and Egypt and Iran and Bangladesh contributed to Germany's debt cancellation. And so that was the world in 1953. And today we're told there's no money for climate finance, there's no debt relief, there's only colonial abuse.
That is an incredible story, and I wasn't aware of the details of that. Looking back at this debt, what you're saying is you won't be surprised by that. That's a key tenet of allowing a colonial country to keep control of the former colonies, is by looking straight away at debt. And we've discussed yesterday what the government debt actually is and how practical is it to kind of take that on and cancel it. But what you're saying is, put that aside, you need to look at this as a way to control the economy once you're supposedly independent again, and that is absolutely fascinating. Now, moving on to what can we do now, Fadhel? Let's say the scenario is Scotland's going to be independent again in 2030. We're not going to have our monetary sovereignty until then or after a transitional period. But what could we be doing now? And I don't just mean the Scottish government, but our whole kind of society and all of our communities. What could we be doing now to try and secure ourselves a better future when we become independent? And I'm thinking specifically around the areas you touch on, the food sovereignty and energy security. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Let's say it's 2030 and you're independent, but you're still food dependent and energy dependent. This means that you can't really walk away from any negotiation table related to debt or trade or any issue. because you walk away and your people can starve, right? You can be cut off from supply lines for food or energy and so on. I'll go back to the question of debt again. If you become independent, you have to take part of the national debt of England. That is designed specifically to make sure that you continue on day one after independence, continue to rewire your economy to earn British pounds so that you can service the debt, which means you have to continue to extract resources to sell to England in order to earn the British pounds that you need to service the debt. So that is designed to keep the same colonial economic relations going, right? So how can you break that colonial relation, and what can you do to prepare for that day? The two fundamental things is to make sure you have energy independence and food independence, which means you start investing today in that food security in the proper sense of the term, and energy security in the proper sense of the term, and develop new international trade routes for your exports, for your economic relations that are not linked to England, that are not linked to the old colonial extraction mode. And the more of that resilience and independence you have economically, the easier it is for you to sit down and negotiate a different deal on day one. And the easier it is for you to walk away from a negotiation table and say, you know what, we're not paying the debt. What are you going to do? Right? But today you can't, none of the countries in the global south can actually walk away from debt payments without serious consequences, without economic, financial, and political pressures, which means you don't truly have full sovereignty. If your sovereign decisions are governed by these colonial pressure points, then you don't fully have sovereignty.
Those are huge structural problems for us. One of the most successful things that our Scottish government says that they've been able to achieve is to have Scotland as the second most popular destination for foreign direct investment in the UK. And as a currency user, like Scotland is, you can see how important it is to attract currency in foreign direct investment in. Does that need to continue to the same extent when Scotland becomes independent and it had its own currency? Do we still need to rely so much on that currency if we have our own currency?
Not necessarily, but as an independent country, you also need to build an industrial base that is independent of the old colonial rules, which means that the foreign direct investment that you're receiving is coming specifically for as part of it's not part of Scottish industrial policy. It's somebody else's industrial policy that has assigned a particular role for the Scottish industrial base to participate in and to contribute to. So that means you're part of somebody else's industrial policy. So how do you develop your own industrial policy on your own terms? As Scotland, your economy is too small to truly industrialize at scale, which means you need to look for partners. You need larger markets, larger access to the complementarity of resources and capabilities that you need. And that's what you have today with England, with foreign direct investment, except it's on their terms, not on your terms. To develop industrial policies on your terms, you need to find other partners who are in an equally difficult position, but put together, you have a large market at scale, you have complementarity of resources and capabilities, and you can co-create industrial policies on fair and equitable terms. And once you establish that, the most likely partners are not going to be the UK or the US or Germany. It's going to be the smaller economies that are similarly limited under the current economic and geopolitical setting. And that includes countries in the global south that are rich in natural resources, for example, and are looking to industrialize on different terms. And that becomes the process of transformation. That becomes the first step in creating this multipolar world that we're talking about. It's not going to be created by the UK or the US or China, for that matter. It's going to be created by countries at the bottom of the hierarchy who are trying to reposition themselves collectively, not individually. And that's a process that Scotland can lead in terms of economic diplomacy for transforming the fortunes of countries that have shared similar histories in the past and continue to share similar submissive positions in this global industrial hierarchy.
That points to a really kind of positive vision for Scotland as re-entering the international community. But I think a big part of that has to start with this understanding that we were, or we still have, an economy which is principally a colonial one. My final question for you, Fadhel, is I would imagine that a lot of countries in Africa would be incredibly envious of the position that Scotland's in right now. So we've been moaning all of these issues about energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, but we have an economy of the global north. How much easier should it be for Scotland to transform its economy, to create a well-being economy, to act in a just way, to create a just transition? Are we just moaning when really we should be looking really positive towards our future?
Absolutely, you're clearly in a much better position in terms of resources and financial and political organization to do much better as an independent nation. But it's about being alert to what the first few days after independence mean once you gain independence, because we have a long track record of countries gaining independence, from England in particular, and we know what that process of independence means. It typically means entrapment by design. So now you're independent, you're governed by your own people, but the rules of the economic game are still keeping you in the same extractive position relative to the global north. But your current resources and capabilities and potential give you the opportunity for Scottish independence movement to design the true pillars of economic and monetary sovereignty before you get to Independence Day, and allows you to design the economic diplomacy and the new industrial policies that you want to form with other countries that have similar aspirations, that have complementarity of resources and capabilities that Scotland doesn't have. And that creates the platform for a new multipolar world from a geopolitical and economic standpoint. And that's why Scottish leadership in this space is important for countries in the global south too.
Thank you so much, and it would be amazing if we could get you over in person, next year or the year after. But thanks so much for that. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure our audience would have got loads from it. Thank you again.
Thank you. My pleasure.